G'day and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. On each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interacted with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to divers to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, and anyone with an intense passion for marine life. My name's Matt Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me today is Chloe Robinson, and she's a cetacean biologist from Canada. And we're going to be talking all about the world of the grey whale. Welcome to the show, Chloe.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
No worries. So before we jump into all the kind of cool whale stuff, I want to hear how your whale journey started and how you got into it.
So my whale journey started back when I was probably about 10 or 11 years old, watching Free Willy for the first time. This was a very pivotal film for me, getting interested, especially in killer whales. And ever since then, I've wanted to work with whales and specifically living in Canada and to work with killer whales. So I kind of didn't give up on that dream. I did all my studies in the UK and then, hopped on a plane to Canada and landed a job working for Oceanwise as a research manager. I began my official career, I like to say, with whales in 2021. And so pleased to be living my dream right now on the west coast of BC.
Oh, and so when I contacted you, I was like, I've done these whales. What whale would you like to talk about? And you were like, I think pretty dominant on the grey whale. Why did you pick grey whales?
I love grey whales because I think they're one of the most underappreciated whales out there. A lot of people commonly refer to them as moving rocks because they, for the untrained eye, it's like, do a double take. Did that rock just move? Just by their coloration and what they look like. And I think there's such amazing and tenacious species of whale, and I'm a sucker for the underdogs. I was really, really keen to shed some light on a species that, is typically classified as a bit boring. So I'm really keen to tell you all the cool things I know about grey whales.
I can't believe people think whales can be boring, especially like grey whales are huge. And they're so cool. They are such cool characters and they're just such beautiful whales. But sometimes people only want the fun, dolphins or the fun killer whales that are breaching out the water and doing all the fun things. But, grey whales are just as impressive. Cool. And so like a lot of people listening to this show probably know what a humpback whale is or a blue whale, but tell us what a grey whale is and where they kind of fit into the cetacean/marine mammal world.
Yeah, so grey whales are very similar to the more commonly known blue whales, humpback whales, in that they're baleen whales. So unlike killer whales and dolphins, they don't have teeth, but they have these keratin plates in their mouth that they use to filter food. So they're very much like you said, the more common species that we're aware of. But what makes them a little bit different is that they don't feed in the same way that humpback whales and blue whales feed. They sift food from actually the sediment of sand. So they're very similar in some ways, but they have kind of in their own category of having this really strange laying on their side, sifting sand, foraging strategy compared to, you imagine big blue and humpback whales, they open their mouth and then engulf prey and then, push the water out. Whereas grey whales really don't do this. They bumble along on the bottom of the sea floor, sifting through mud with their mouths, which sounds pretty gross, but it makes them really unique in that sort of baleen whale category.
Yeah, wow, I've got like so many questions about like that process and the first one I have to ask is, so grey whales are found in the northern hemisphere primarily. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, actually only in the North Pacific.
In the North Pacific. Cool.
They used to be in the North Atlantic, but they were totally wiped out during the commercial whaling era. But actually, funnily enough, in 2024, someone did actually see a grey whale off Nantucket, of all places. And they think that it was a Pacific whale that came over during the summer, basically over the top of the Arctic. But they're only actually found in the North Pacific.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, now I've got too much to unpack. Yeah, I'm gonna jump back to the feeding real quick before we do that migration thing, because I wrote down that like some cool stuff about the migration to ask you. But for the feeding, I was going to say, so they're found in the Northern Hemisphere. Is there a whale or an animal that does that same kind of filter feeding of mud in the southern hemisphere, or is it just this really unique whale?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's the foraging and how whales feed is actually something that is really not very well known for all species. So we know, those whales that feed, come to the surface, do all that fun stuff. But really, grey whales are one of the only species to do this benthic feeding strategy on the seafloor. And, the only reason that we found out that they do this is because after whales have been in an area, divers go down and they actually see like these trenches where the grey whales have almost like, you can imagine yourself with a spoon in yogurt, for example. You leave that trail where your spoon has been, and grey whales kind of do the same thing on the benthic sea floor. All the other species, including southern hemisphere whales, typically feed pelagically, which is sort of mid-water column. But grey whales are really highly specialized to feed in this kind of benthic, mud filtering strategy.
Yeah. It just makes me wonder why there aren't like a species of grey whale in the south.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really interesting because we, again, only know what we know in terms of our observations of these whales. There's been a few anecdotal observations of grey whales off Africa and other locations where like, oh, that's really interesting. What it really comes down to is what food's available. So it's the habitats that we have in the North Pacific and the types of sediment combined with the, little fish and invertebrates. And like ghost shrimp's one of their favorite foods. Sometimes it's only found in one place. So then there's no kind of need for that niche and there's not, availability of that food for another species to take advantage. But that's probably one of the main drivers towards this behavior we see in the North Pacific.
Yeah. And I can very much imagine like a blue whale or humpback whale. It opens its mouth, it scoops up a bunch of water, it swallows it, pushes the water out. Yum, yum. I'm still struggling with how a grey whale does that with mud. Is it one big gulp? Or as you said with the trail, is it just slowly like opens its jaw and drags it through the sediment? Like,
exactly.
Try and describe it for us.
Yeah, it's the latter. So I kind of see it as, when there's people and they're sifting for gold and they kind of continuously run water over and shake it. Well, whales are kind of doing that with their mouths. So they're constantly running over and that kind of open, shut really, really quick. That kind of traps anything then in their baleen and lets the water pass through. So, grey whales dive around 10, sometimes 15 minutes. So you can imagine 10, 15 minutes just doing this constantly, often in a circular pattern. And then they'll come up, breathe for a bit and go down and do the same thing. So they're doing lots and lots of little, it's almost like us equivalent of sifting through something with our fingertips. Grey whales just do this with their mouths. As they're a bit like the T-Rex of the whale world in terms of their little pectorals can't quite reach.
Wow. And, on a bad note, does that mean that they're specifically susceptible to certain kinds of marine plastic, ocean plastic?
Yeah, it makes them susceptible to a couple of things. One being exactly that, anything that's on the sea floor. They have, similar to humpback whales, their throat is around the size of a grapefruit. So they can't really swallow anything. So all of these news outlets you see around, someone got swallowed by a humpback whale. It's not possible unless you're smaller than a grapefruit. So anything that's on that sea floor, that's small enough to go down their throat, obviously they're at risk of swallowing this. But not only that, you can imagine, these whales are down 10, 15 minutes foraging, then they need to come up for air. They're not the smartest of animals in terms of they don't know when boats are around. So you can imagine it's just like, it's like stepping out onto the road with your eyes closed. You're just kind of hoping there's not going to be anything up there. And that actually makes them really susceptible to vessel strike as well. And then again, if you think about what else sits on the seafloor, and a lot of crab pots and fishing gear. Again, this means that they're also likely at a higher risk of getting entangled in those ropes and lines because they're spending a lot of time down there with, not only natural debris, but human debris. And human fishing gear.
Yeah. I imagine, do things like hooks and stuff cause them issue, or have they got a pretty good stomach once they can swallow it?
It's a really good question. The only really way to see if those kind of, like hooks and other debris really have an impact is if we have a whale that washes up dead in a good enough condition that you can do a bit of a necropsy, which is basically an animal autopsy to see what was in the stomach and other things. For baleen whales, there haven't actually been a lot of cases, so baleen whales like grey whales, in having sort of plastics and hooks and other things ingested in the system. Especially, this is more of an issue for sperm whales and killer whales that are known to sort of take fish off fishing lines and things like that. But the bigger threat really is mud is a place where things accumulate too, right? So you may know anyone who's listening who likes shellfish. A lot of the time, you got to let that shellfish kind of breathe in a fresher water than it's typically found in. But you can imagine grey whales instead, they're basically shoving their entire faces in, sediment that can contain a whole bunch of chemical contaminants and other things. So long story short, we don't really know the prevalence of things like hooks and other things in grey whales, mostly because if that does cause a death, normally they die out to sea, they don't wash up. And most of the ones that wash up often have either been hit by vessels or have died of starvation or something along those lines. But yeah, I would be intrigued to see, I would assume not as much as our toothed whales that kind of typically operate and hang out in areas where there's more hook fishing.
Yeah. So that was a bit of a tangent down the whale pathway. But talking about how they bury their face in the mud and so forth, I want people to get a bit of a picture of a grey whale. So they're about 15 meters long. And tell us about their face, because it's quite an unusual ecology and dynamic way they look.
Yeah, I think they're really pretty whales. I think I'm a bit biased. I love all whales, but they have got, you kind of imagine, those of you who know, what a humpback face looks like, they've got a pretty big head. They've got lots of these little tubercles, little wart things all over their face. But grey whales have a very kind of streamlined face, and it's almost reminds me of, like a greyhound or a whippet, that kind of style, that kind of equivalent long nose. They've got a bit of almost a two-dimensional looking heads. They've got a very smooth, very small head for their body shape compared to humpback whales that are of, relative size. And they don't have a lot of features. And I think this is a bit of an evolutionary adaptation, because if you have a bunch of features, tubercles and other things, little nodules on your face, and you're constantly rubbing in the sea floor, you leave yourself open to cuts, infection, and that doesn't really give you a lot, in terms of long-term health and survival. So they've got very streamlined, very basic, quite pretty. As I said, it really reminds me of bull terriers. Very reminds me of, they're almost like the bull terriers of the real world, that kind of almost rectangular face. I think they're really pretty.
Yeah, a bit more developed for digging into the mud rather than...
Exactly, yes. Imagine you trying to dig with, a spade versus a rake. You're probably going to get a bit further with a spade than you are a rake. So it's similar to the whales too.
And how do you identify a grey whale? So say you're out whale watching and some whales go past. How would you be like, that's a grey whale, not a humpback or not a minke or something like that?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the fact that they are moving rocks, and this is probably the best, people are probably trying to picture what a moving rock looks like, but they're essentially a very sort of, quite literally, a slate grey, a mottled grey colour. They're often covered in barnacles or some sort of bright orange whale lice. So each individual whale can look very different to one another, unlike killer whales that can all look relatively the same, black and white with a bit of grey. Grey whales all look a little bit different. They're all slightly different shades of grey. Some have more white splotches. Some have more orangey grey splotches. And they don't have a dorsal fin. So unlike, the big 6 foot tall dorsal fin of a killer whale, or the sort of smaller, discrete dorsal fin, which is the fin on top of the body of humpback whales, grey whales don't have any. So they're totally smooth, apart from a few little, what we call knuckles, which is a little kind of nodule sticking out down their back towards the end of their spine. So this, again, there's nothing to get caught on anything if they are down at those depths. But they do very much just look like rocks with a bit of, lichen moss moving through the water.
Cool. And so you mentioned sea lice and cuts and stuff. Is that a relationship they have, like the sea lice help them recover from abrasions they might get feeding?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because with grey whales, there's not a lot that's been done looking at, the symbiotic relationship between lice. For example, we know that, we don't even know why whales breach, for example. Grey whales aren't typically very breachy. I would kind of call them the introverts of the whale world in that way. But, we think that humpback whales breach to get rid of barnacles and to warmer waters where barnacles and lice drop off. I think it's a bit like anything in nature. There's a balance. When the whale is severely compromised, sometimes the lice take over the whole body, and that's, a sign that a whale's not well. But it's very much the case of, they're there for a purpose, and that purpose is more than likely to exactly forage on bits of dead skin. It's like getting a bit of a constant spa treatment on the skin. But like anything, if they have, a big injury or something, they can actually get overrun with lice, and that can be a part of the problem.
Yeah. And so you mentioned breaching. Do grey whales breach, or what kind of behavior do they exhibit?
So they have been known to breach on occasion. They are very sort of, people call them shy and elusive, but I call them more introverted whales. You just imagine, a humpback whale, they do their breaching. When they dive, you see that beautiful tail fluke comes up. But I don't do any of this. It's pretty rare to actually get, the underside picture of that fluke of a tail of a grey whale. They will typically surface when they're foraging and be just surface in like a circular motion. So they'll be in the same place, sometimes for weeks, if not months, foraging in one location. But they're very subtle. They'll surface, 4 or 5 times at the water surface, and they'll go back down again for another, 10, 15 minutes. This is, again, unfortunately, what gets them a bit of a name of being a bit of a boring whale. But one of the things I love about grey whales is their blow, so the exhale breath, is shaped like a heart, which is pretty cute. And it's a really good way of knowing, sometimes in rough water, it can be like, is that a grey? Is that a humpback whale? What is that? And you see that heart-shaped blow versus the more vertical blow of a humpback whale. And you're like, oh, that's a grey whale. So, in reality, they're pretty boring at the surface. But sometimes they can do something called spy hop, which is basically where they vertically stick their heads out of the water. Again, something that's more akin and known in killer whales. Again, my brain goes back to the Free Willy footage of all of these whales spy hopping. Grey whales do this too sometimes. And it's pretty cool when they do it because, as I said, they're very strange shape. And the only other kind of thing I will akin them to, they kind of remind me a little bit like a dinosaur. Almost like lizardy, that kind of very strange to see this weird head popping out of the water. But they're pretty chill on the surface. They keep all their action for below the waves.
Cool. And does that make knowing what their population is hard? Because can you identify an individual from the surface, or does it get a bit more emergent?
Yeah.
Ahoy, Matt here. Just a quick pause to let you know about the Big Fish card game. It's an awesome tabletop card game that I've been developing with a few others. It's been out for almost a year now. It's a great way to support the show. That's the Big Fish card game. Visit bigfishcardgame.com. Back to the show.
Yeah, you can actually. So on our part of the coast, on the west coast of Canada, and just the west coast of North America, a group called Cascadia Research Collective have a really extensive ID catalogue, among others, of and what we call lateral images of grey whales. So when they're at the surface, you can kind of see like a half moon shape of their body, you can imagine, on the surface. And whales have got really unique patches, as I mentioned, white spots and grey spots and scars as well, barnacle scars that last their lives. So we can actually just look at these lateral images taken when a whale is surfacing to identify individuals. Most catalogues only have these images. For some whales that do flukes, there's also tail images that can be used, but they use the left and the right side. For example, there's one whale right now that's hanging out in downtown Vancouver called Little Patch, and because the whale has a little patch. So this, you can use all these different markings and shapes to come up with names and as a way to track where individuals go.
Oh, and so you said there's a whale right where you are now. Like, what's been your favorite whale encounter?
So, this is going back to around 2022. I hadn't long moved to Vancouver Island, and I still hadn't seen a grey whale. They've been on my list. Everyone has bucket lists. I have a bucket list of whale species to see, and there was news that there was a grey whale hanging out near the coast, and I was like, I want to go see him. And I went out to this location called 10 Mile Point on Vancouver Island, which is a dive site as well. And there was literally a grey whale foraging meters from the shoreline, consistently. And I was there for hours taking images. It was really cool to see this whale so close from shore. It was actually a new whale, never been seen in this area. And then not long after, another whale turned up, another new whale not seen in the area before. So we had 2 grey whales hanging out at the same time and kind of moving between different beaches up and down, southern Vancouver Island. And I was tracking them for days, in sunset images, and you've got the beautiful grey whale surfacing. It was lovely. And then, another Another one of my favorite encounters was probably off the west coast of Vancouver Island, off Ucluelet, another huge hotspot. This is a normal hotspot for grey whales as they're migrating up the outside of Vancouver Island. I managed to see a whole bunch feeding, again, really close to shore. So I've had some really special, land-based encounters with these whales. And yeah, they were my first whale I saw after I gave birth to my kids. So I was out, a couple of months on my maternity leave watching actually that same grey whale from 2022 coming back to the same spot year to the exact day when it was seen again, which was pretty special.
Yeah, that's awesome. And is that kind of because I feel like some people will be like, oh, like whale watching, it's in Australia, it's very much an offshore thing. But grey whales love the shallows, and you can actually be 10 meters from a grey whale if you're standing on the shore, can't you?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. I think, I've had some pretty special encounters off the west coast of Vancouver Island from whale watch trips too, going out a bit further, as you say. But especially, the west coast of North America, the kind of coastlines we have the shallow, fine sediment areas along the shore. Whales will just forage in these areas, like meters from the shore. It's actually, it's pretty impressive, and it's all just due to, the bathymetry, how the sea floor is in our area here. And it's, there's nothing like being on the shoreline with, sometimes up to 100 other people watching this whale just doing its thing, and it doesn't even know you're there. It's just chilling.
Yeah, cool. And that kind of brings me to the next thing that I was super excited to learn about is that there's actually, you work at OceanWise and you've developed a cool app to track whales locally and globally. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's right. So in 2015, we launched the Whale Report app. This app enables any member of the public to report sightings of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and our honorary cetacean, the sea turtles. Initially, this was launched in British Columbia off the west coast of Canada, but now the app is actually accessible worldwide. So the cool thing about this app is it means because we have people submitting sightings in real time of whales, this information can then go out in real time to help better protect them. So, for example, since 2018, we've sent over 90,000 alerts to commercial mariners. So these are people such as, pilots of big cargo container ships, it's ferry captains, cruise captains, enabling them to know that there's a whale within their area so they can take action such as slowing down, diverting their course, or just keeping a closer eye on, if there's a whale around them. So the cool thing about this is it is, I think it's 90% driven by members of the public. So we have a really strong network of citizen scientists, not only here, but it's actually increasing in other places around the world. We've had a few reports go out in New Zealand and the east coast of Australia and within Europe. It is a way that you can not only report your sightings to protect whales, but then this information goes back to the conservationists, people like myself, and other people in local geographies helping to better protect these whales with longer term conservation and policies.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I have to ask two questions about this. One is, do you find mariners or ferry boat drivers are very keen to uptake it, or is that a bit of a battle? And what was my second question? Let's start with that. Do they uptake it a lot?
So, the cool thing about the Whale Report app and the extension of the alert system, which is called the Whale Report Alert System, actually, they came to us. They were like, hey, we want to know if there's a whale near us. And we were like, okay, well, we have a lot of citizen scientists, reporting their sightings, but, we can't be 100% sure that the species are correct, right? Because you can have the best intentions and the best training, but people might not necessarily get the species right. And they're like, do you know what? We don't even care. We just want to know if there is a, large marine mammal, whale, a dolphin in our vicinity so we can do something about it. So actually, we kind of phrase we use is Whale Report, and the RAS is its acronym for Whale Report Alert System, was created with mariners by mariners. They came to us asking for this. And as of, today, we have around 125 marine organizations signed up to this and over 900 user accounts. So we've actually seen the uptake has been pretty impressive, and to the point now where we're getting people from international geographies, places such as India and Northern Indian Ocean, and pilots from the east coast of Australia reaching out saying, well, hey, how can we get this real-time data? So it's actually really encouraging to see how proactive the mariner community has been. It is entirely voluntary to get this information and receive these alerts, but we can really see no one wants to hit a whale, no one wants to disturb a whale, and it's really encouraging to see the the drive of these mariners to do this.
Yeah, cool. Ahoy! Just a quick little pause to let you know that I've made some cool sea creatures, fish, and invertebrate ID cards for Tasmania. So if you are in Tasmania or anywhere else and you love fish and invertebrates, kind of miniature field guides, I've got these cards. They're waterproof. You can take them underwater. They're quite cool. They're going to be up on the seacreatures.world website and my other website, mtunderwatermedia.com. Now back to the show. And I'm going to flip it for a minute and be like, are you getting the opposite problem as well, which is people see like, oh, there's an alert out, I'm going to go look for that whale on my boat? Because I know that happens in Australia.
So one of the unique things about our system is these alerts only go out to approved users. So for example, alerts do not go out to ecotourism, whale watch vessels, or recreational boaters. People that require access to get that real-time information, we provide training to, and we will only provide access if they are part of a professional marine organization. So Joe Blogs that has, a house overlooking the ocean is not going to get access to real-time information, exactly to prevent that. There is a bit of a fine balance between information for all to reduce disturbance and then information for all that increases disturbance. So we try to strike that balance by only sending alerts out to commercial operators that in reality, if they were to hit a whale, is going to have devastating consequences versus, as I said, Joe Blogs on his, small little runaround vessel that, even if they were to hit a whale, likely would not do a lot of harm. So we try and target the groups that need the information the most.
Yeah, cool. And one thing I'm excited about with it is that, like you mentioned that there's the whales off North America and in off I think north of Korea and Japan. Mm-hmm. But there used to be whales in the Atlantic on the other side, and occasionally you still see them, and the app can kind of help with that. But talk us about this crazy phenomenon of whales just popping up on the other side of a massive continent.
Yeah, so back in the 19th century during the commercial whaling era, hundreds of thousands, even millions of whales were killed in that process. And one of those species, due again to their pretty chill on the surface, they're pretty slow, was grey whales. And this actually led to them being totally extinct from the North Atlantic Ocean. So there used to be grey whales, a separate population of grey whales here. But funnily enough, in 2024, summer months of 2024, a grey whale was actually seen off Nantucket, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. And to me, that highlights another threat that these whales face, and that's climate change, right? The Arctic sea ice melting more and more and more every year. It is likely, most scientists tend to hypothesize that this whale probably swam across the entire North American continent to turn up on the east coast of America, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. And sometimes these whales even turn up off the east coast of Africa and the west coast of Africa and all sorts of places. And again, anecdotal unless, it's a bit like, if there's no pics, no proof kind of thing. But this whale off Nantucket was extensively photographed with drone and was in pretty good body condition, looked pretty healthy, which is like, maybe we do have a very small subset of grey whales remaining in the Atlantic. Who knows? We really don't know. But that's what makes citizen science initiatives so cool, because as scientists, we can't be everywhere. We can't be on the water in every location, but people live across the entire world. So we can tap into those locals with that local knowledge and those, situational, being in a best place at the best time to capture some of these, these phenomenon. Most often it isn't scientists that capture these things. It's the ordinary person. And that's what makes things like, reporting your sightings through apps so important for this global look at how whales are doing.
Yeah. And so I'm going to ask a tricky science question, not tricky science question, but an awkward one. So if you had to hypothesize, so like kind of think of, put your money on an answer, would you say that whale or the grey whales seen in the Atlantic are migrating across, or they're from that small remnant population? Because they can live up to like 80 years, I think.
So I I have a bit of a conservation curse of being a glass half full person. Those people who work in conservation know that, you've always got to have a bit of grounded in reality when you talk about things, everything from, for example, other resident killer whales, probably many people know, a brand new calf popped up 2 days ago in the population, and I can't help but fall in love and be excited and be like, this one's going to make it. It's going to be good. That's the mentality I have in conservation, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't have that mentality. So my answer to that is I think that there's still a population out in the Atlantic. The ocean is so big. We cannot possibly know everything. We know more about space than we do our oceans. And I like to think that there is a small population of grey whales that managed to persist through the whaling era and survive today. And just every now and again, we have interactions with them where we see them. That would probably be such an amazing situation if that was real, because we could learn so much from that population if they are persisting. But I think logically, it's the equivalent of you're driving down a highway with 100 restaurants, but instead you drive across the other side of the world to go to a restaurant. Why would a whale do that? And I kind of think the same thing of a whale migrating across the entirety of the Arctic. Why would you do this to potentially get to grounds when you've just gone past 1,000,001 spots where you can forage? So I like to think there is a remnant population, and I love that Mother Nature doesn't give up her secrets readily. And that's where I sit on that, definitely.
Cool. And that brings me to so many whale questions. That brings me to another question is, how do they know where to go? How do they work on navigation? How do we know this whale just took a wrong turn at the Arctic?
So we do know that whales do take wrong turns. There's many funny stories. Those of you can probably tell by my accent, I am Canadian, but I'm not Canadian by birth. I'm from the UK, and there's one side of the UK that's full of whales, another side of the UK that's not very full of whales. But sometimes they just take a wrong turn. This happens, but most of the time they take a wrong turn, they wash up dead. Because they've gone in a spot where there's no food for them for a long time, or they're a bit unwell. Again, it's not been proven, but we hypothesize that whales use the Earth's magnetic field to migrate. It is the only kind of logical explanation for a whale that doesn't have great eyesight, that doesn't have, we can't study it to know if it knows landmarks and things like this. So based on this, it is hypothesized that they follow the Earth's magnetic field. And they learn this from their parents too. So, the mum, she will migrate north with her calf, and then pretty much that calf is mostly deaf for itself to then come back down again. So it's, what we call innate. It's built into their bodies to be able to follow the Earth's magnetic field. I would kind of see it a little bit like on the plane when you have the landing strip, in case of an emergency, follow the lit floors. It's a little bit like this. Whales are almost following a lit floor all the way up from their breeding to their feeding grounds.
And how do they follow the Earth's magnetic field? What lets them do that?
It's a great question. We don't really know.
Ooh, I love a mystery.
It's the cool and good and bad thing about whales is you can't really put them in MRI and other machines to see what's going on in their brain. But, there's been some, theories that whales have, it's a little bit like they've got their own internal GPS system that aligns with the Earth's magnetic field. We don't really know how it works, but there's been similar studies looked at birds, other migratory species. And, it's expected that whales have something similar in their, biology and their brain chemistry that allows them to follow this and to, know where they are based on being able to read, magnetic fields or changes in magnetic field. It's really relatively unexplored, and it's really hard to understand, as you said, because we can't really study whales the same way that we can study birds and other migratory species.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. I love that as an animal that is so dominant in our society and culture, but we still don't know how they really do things.
So I love it. The mysteries. I think science would be boring if it didn't have mysteries.
And so kind of like we're kind of getting to the end of the show a little bit, but if people want to see a grey whale or they want to have a grey whale experience, talk us through what you would do, what you wouldn't do, because with humpback whales, which I keep coming back to being Australian, you can go for swims with them in certain places, and you can do a lot of whale watching tours, and that's pretty proven to be pretty harmless for the humpback whales. But are grey whales different, or what's your experience?
Yeah, so there's the interesting thing about grey whales, because they don't really do much at the surface. There aren't as many tours or whale watching experiences that are really catered towards grey whales, as there are humpback whale watching tours. But the cool thing about grey whales is you don't need to necessarily go on a boat to see them. I mean, they're pretty limited in terms of, you got to be somewhere within the Pacific to see grey whales. But during the summer months, so anywhere between, May and all the way up to, sometimes even November, you can pretty much see grey whales from shore in some of these hotspot locations. The best one and one of the only whale watch, tours that go out and target grey whales in particular is on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And they go from Tofino, which is a small town, and they go out to look for the grey whales, and they do a tour there. But honestly, because of their nearshore foraging, they kind of split grey whales into three populations, and one of them is the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, and these are the ones that don't just kind of get on the highway and zoom all the way up to Alaska. These I kind of call them, they're like the serial snackers. So they constantly, as they're going up the coast, they stop in San Francisco and they'll have a bite to eat. Last year, for example, that was a big deal. And they were in San Francisco Bay for weeks and months on end, snacking there. Then they'll come up and snack, literally off Victoria. You'd be sat there and all of a sudden a grey whale pops up next to you. So it's using Facebook groups. That's one of the best ways to know when there are whales around. And they often will be in one place for a period of time. So one thing I recommend people don't do, which not everyone, but a lot of people have the tendency to think, oh, well, I'm on a kayak, I'm on a paddleboard, I'm going to go out and get closer. Whales are so, unpredictable. Even something as gentle and with no teeth as a grey whale, that's a lot of whale to be surfacing unexpectedly, potentially knocking you off balance.
How much do they weigh?
So they weigh between 35 and 45 tons.
So you don't want to be hit by that.
No, and coming up to the surface, if you've held your breath for 15 minutes, you're not going to be taking your time to come to the surface. That I really recommend people keep their distance. Look at your local marine mammal regulations, give whales space, even though you don't have an engine. If you're on a kayak or a paddleboard, you can cause, disturbance. You can cause the whales to panic and come up too early. You're basically interrupting their meals if you become too close. But really, using local Facebook groups that report sightings and, trying to find those locations from land. Whale watching has its uses and place. Don't get me wrong, I go whale watching, but I think we all owe it to the whales to try and be as less invasive as possible. Grey whales give us that opportunity to watch from land the way that you can't necessarily do with humpback whales and other, mentioned offshore tours. The whales are really close to the shore. They can come in and they can, they'll hang out and look for those heart-shaped blows. If you see something surface and you see kind of heart shape and you don't really see much at the surface, that's probably a grey whale. Especially if you get a nice calm day, you get really beautiful grey whale blows.
Cool. I also just love the idea that you can be going for like a swim in the ocean or a dive and you're like 10, 20 meters from shore and there's a huge whale, because that doesn't really happen with other whale species.
No, it's pretty special, and like I mentioned, Little Patch being literally in the harbour, all vessel activity in Vancouver is attracted a lot of attention, good and bad, for that whale. But it just, I think more than anything, shows their tenacity. They're like, hey, there's good food here. Yeah, there may be lots of people in Wales, but I'm not, giving up my grub to kind of move away. And I think that also makes me happy that, coexistence with whales is a big deal. We, as humans, need to function and grow and have trade and everything, but at the same time, we need to respect our wildlife. And it's really encouraging to see everybody reporting, the sightings of Little Patch being back and making others aware of the rules and regulations to help reduce, the risk of disturbing this whale. It's we found there's been a lot of decline in their body conditions. They've been struggling to find food. There's a lot more skinny grey whales. They've shrunk in size. So we need to help them get as much food as they can. And we can do that by not interrupting their meal times.
Yeah. And I guess like every time an animal, lots of animals from birds to whales are feeding and then you disrupt them, they're using a lot of energy to get away. And then it's like kind of like if you sit down at a restaurant and I put the fire alarm off every 5 minutes, by the end of it, you're more exhausted than you were. You might as well not have eaten.
No, that's exactly the case, and these whales, it takes a lot of, energy and, physiological changes to be able to dive at those depths and forage at those depths. So it's really critical. We give them space to have their meals and then they often move on to new places. And not only that, again, going back to that, they've got their faces in the mud. It's really important what we put down the drains and what we put in our water systems. Everything ends in the ocean, and so be really mindful of proper disposal of chemicals and other things. So we don't have grey whales, putting their faces in these legacy contaminants that build up in their systems and actually cause premature death.
Yeah. And I always say on that note that one thing that I get frustrated about is people who wash their cars in their driveways. And there's a lot of soap, a lot of suds. They might be waxing it, using a tire cleaner, which is a really harsh chemical. And then they just wash it all off, and they don't think that, it goes straight into the ocean, to straight where these whales are, often sitting in the sediment. It's good.
Yeah, exactly that. There's lots of things people can do, to reduce not only chemicals, but things like microfibers going into the ocean. Again, microfibers has been a big, topic in the news recently, but these build up in the food chain as well. And it's being really mindful of anything in terms of, how you wash your cars, how you do things. There's lots of tips and tricks you can do. And if everyone did a little bit of this, it will just really dramatically reduce the amount going into our oceans.
Yeah. And I think all too often we feel quite powerless about, what we can do, because there's, climate change is such a big issue. It's such a political issue. But yeah, to think just what you wash your car with or the laundry detergent you use can make
make a world of difference. As I said, we like to say, with the app, you could save whales from the palm of your hand, and that's exactly what we want to do. We want to help empower people. Oceanwise aims to empower people to help protect and restore our ocean. And, one way we do this is through our app. That's, if you're sitting there thinking, what can I do? What can I do? New Year's resolutions coming out. What can I do in 2026 to help protect whales, even in areas where Oceanwise doesn't function? With being in a Canadian organisation, you can still report your whale sighting. That helps so much, like you wouldn't believe. And if everybody reported their whale when they saw it, can you just imagine how much data there would be that would help go to protect these whales?
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, that kind of is almost the end, but I always love to finish with a few cool facts. And I've got one that I want fact-checked. So
cool. Me?
In my deep dive into grey whales, I came across reference that they're right and left-handed. And that's to do with how they feed. Correct my cool fact, or expand on it, please. I want to know.
No, this is something that has been seen actually. And this goes to, as I mentioned, they kind of go on their side, they open and shut their mouths and they forage. Some whales prefer to go on one side than the other. Again, a bit like humans being right or left-handed, or I guess right or left flipped or faced in this case.
I love it. Right or left faced.
Yeah. And this is exactly, so there has been quite a few cases. Again, these divers go down after and they see the craters, but people have filmed grey whales foraging, and they see this. So some whales do prefer one or the other. It's a little bit like us. We're not identically symmetrical on both our sides. And, whales have a preference. I'm sure it exists for other whale species too, but for something as, targeted as a grey whale on, that's definitely something that I've heard and seen some footage of too. So yeah, I can give that a big tick.
A right or left face. Well, that was my one. Do you have any cool facts about grey whales we haven't touched on?
I think one of the coolest facts about grey whales is the noise they make. So it's really hard in a way to describe the noise they make, but they sound like bongo drums. Now, it's not a noise you would imagine a grey whale to make. You think of humpback whale's song as being beautiful and, the long moans and all these different things, whereas grey whales literally just sound like either like someone knocking at a door or bongo drums. I've heard it a few times and it always just makes me laugh because I'm like, really? Again, there's just so much that goes on beneath the waves that we just don't see. And I just love the fact that there are grey whales out there, having their own little underwater party with their little knocking and bongo drum sounds.
Again, I just am imagining going for a scuba dive, seeing a giant 40-ton, 16-meter rock and hearing bongo drums underwater. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Cool. Well, and the final fact I'll finish on, which we were talking before the show, is you actually hold a world record.
I do, yes. I've been collecting cetaceans, so this is kind of the collective term for whales, dolphins, and porpoises, tattoos since I was doing my PhD in the UK, and I actually hold the world record for the most cetaceans tattooed on a human female body, which I'm currently at 58, one of which is of a grey whale. So, that is, I was randomly thinking, hey, is there a record for this? And no, there wasn't. So I kind of created and set my own record. So I like to say that I wear my passion and my work on my sleeves, quite literally. And I often celebrate new tattoos of whales when we publish new papers or we get new grants. So I'm very well decorated in whale tattoos.
Are they all different cetacean species, or is there one that you have repeated?
My most common tattoo is definitely humpback and killer whales. Being in the Pacific Northwest, there's lots and lots of tattoo artists that focus on those species. But I believe I have 9 or 10 species of cetacean. Everything from the smallest cetacean, the vaquita, and my largest tattoo is probably of a zombie humpback, which is pretty. You can just imagine what that looks like. It's a pretty cool kind of half dead, half alive humpback whale that goes across my leg. So, I got a whole bunch of different species.
Yeah, cool. I mean, zombie humpback whale. For a second, I was like, is that a species of humpback whale? But
it's just, I couldn't. I like to try and get art that's relatively realistic, but this is a very realistic piece, and it's exactly what you can imagine if a humpback whale decided to eat brains instead of fish and small invertebrates. So it's a really cool piece. It's a bit more of one of my abstract pieces, but I love it.
Awesome. Well, on that note, we'll kind of wrap up. But before we do, tell us if people want to learn more about OceanWise, where you work, or the app, or just more about grey whales and stuff. What should they do and where should they go?
So if you want to find out more about what we do at OceanWise, we are on Facebook, Instagram. We have a website, a very easy address, ocean.org. Very easy to find. You can find out all the work we do within the Whales team. You can find out more about how to access and download the Whale Report app. It's very easy. There's a little black fish icon if you're using, if you've got an Android or an Apple phone, you can access it very easily. And there's an iPad version as well of it. We have a blog. We have several blogs that we've put out, mostly written by yours truly, about grey whales, especially about those unique grey whales that we had visiting after many, many, many years of there not being any grey whales in this area. So you can check those out on our website. And if you want to keep up with some of the other sort of the more fun day-to-day work we're doing, and we are on Instagram, OceanWise, we share a bunch of our images from the field. Especially we have a lot of research. We go out and we do work with all sorts of species here off the west coast of BC. So you can check out our Instagram and our LinkedIn with some of more of our studies and publications are posted. And I think the thing that I want to leave everyone with to protect whales, just report what you see and help support whales better by knowing what you're putting down the drain, settings you're using on your washing machine, and support wherever you can in terms of reuse, recycle, and reduce your use on things like plastics and everything. So all the little actions you can do in day to day, from saving whales from the palm of your hand to, washing on call, can help protect the giants of the sea.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been great to speak to you about one of my favorite species, the grey whale.
Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. Music by the talented Dan Musil, and production assistance by George McGrath. Huge thanks to all our Patreon supporters, and if you've liked the show, please jump onto Patreon and help us out. Keep the show running. That's www.patreon.com/SeaCreaturesPodcast. You can also check out the Seacreatures Podcast Instagram at Seacreatures_podcast, or my photography at Matt_Testoni_photography. Coming up next time on the Seacreatures Podcast, we're going to be looking into the wonderful world of jellyfish. This has been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.